This is House Planning Help episode 160. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is Master Thatcher Stephen Letch. We're going to talk about the craft of thatching, the origins, the techniques, and its use today, but also whether it could be used on more new builds. Big question mark hanging there. We'll ask Stephen in a moment. Personally, I love all of these materials: straw bale, lime render, clay plasters, and so on. Thatching, we're talking a variety of materials today. And that's why I thought this tied in quite nicely with the first event really that I'm going to this year. It's the Healthy Buildings Conference and Expo at UCL, and it's midway through February, hosted by the ASBP, the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products. And I thought quite often on this podcast, we're talking about getting the energy right down for the buildings we make. However, of course, just as important is those materials and thinking where they come from and whether they're sustainable materials. So I'm really looking forward to this. Some good sessions in amongst the conference. So perhaps you're thinking about going on. I'd love to see you down there. We'll put the link in the show notes just to entice you a little bit further. Let's get to our featured interview then with Master Thatcher Stephen Letch. He's a member of the National Thatching Straw Growers Association and East Anglia Master Thatchers Association. He's got plenty of experience. I know about him through his involvement with some innovative thatching on the Enterprise Centre at UEA, a building that I really respect, largely because I know quite a lot of the stories behind the building and the lengths that they went to just on so many counts. If you don't know much about that building, it's not a house, but it is quite a large scale building that they've put so much thought into. And I wrote an article for Passive House Plus magazine a few months back. Really enjoyed just getting the opportunity to do that. So we're talking everything thatch today. Let's get going. I started by asking Stephen to tell me a little bit about his background.
I've been thatching for 42 years now, and it's basically the only trade job I've ever done, and I'm pretty pleased that I took up the job. It's been a way of life in a sense.
How did you get into it? As it's something that you've done for such a long time? Was it in the family or because of the area?
No, it wasn't in the family, but I'd overheard, well, this is back in the 70s, when we had the 3-day week, the problems with getting jobs at the time. I just thought, oh no, we're coming out the Formica age. Let's get back to some real trades and work. And it's just tickled my fancy to work outside and learn a trade.
Who were the first people to use thatch and why?
Now thatching, yes. The origins are probably lost in time, but you can probably trace it back at least as far as the hunter-gatherers. And in a sense, it predates all other construction forms, so it's a forerunner of modern construction. That sounds strange, but the reasons for thatching being so fundamental for human development, I guess, was the need for shelter from all the elements: wind, rain, sun, all those things. That's how thatching would have started. If you were to go, say, to the countries nearer the equator, you'd find their needs for thatching would be to keep the sun off, to protect them from the sun and the occasional downpours of rain. Whereas you get further away from the equator into temperate zones, and then the thatching has to be that much more robust. It's got to put up with higher winds, colder weather, wet, and of course it keeps the warmth in as well.
Maybe we should define what thatching is in this early part of the interview.
Oh, yeah. Well, thatching is basically compact plant material, and the whole idea is to keep mostly the wet weather out. So when it rains, as long as that compact plant material is at a good pitch, so it's on a steep roof, the rain, snow, anything like that just bounces off. So you wouldn't find that there'd be any ingress of water on a good thatch any deeper than the first 1.5 centimetres. So everything underneath that is bone dry.
And that top layer, I'm assuming it doesn't stay wet the whole time, it dries out again.
It generally dries out, the sun and the wind, it dries out. And the whole idea of a good thatch lasting as long as possible is controlling that surface decay. And the surface decay is usually through the brown rots, which are sort of intransigent. They survive for a while and then die off as soon as the moisture levels are gone. So the decay levels are very, very slow. So you can get a roof or different roofs lasting between 40 and 70 years.
What materials make a good thatch?
There's a number of materials, depending which part of the world you're in, but we'll say the UK for now. The three traditional types of thatching materials would have been long wheat straw, Norfolk reed, and heather. And down in the West Country, they used a form of wheat straw that's put through a comber, and they call that combed wheat reed. So it's similar in appearance to water reed.
And these materials, was it to do with availability and also performing well in their job?
Yes, it's mostly local availability. So let's say, for example, we're living in the Broads and we want to build a house in the Broads. You won't be finding very many arable fields in the Broads, but plenty of wetland and reed. So you'd find in an area like that, traditionally, the roofs would have been thatched with water reed. And then you'd go further inland where the arable crops are growing, and that would be predominantly long straw or comb wheat reed, as you would in the West Country. And then you'd go up further north to, say, Northumbria or Scotland, and you've got all the heather growing up there that haven't got any possibility of growing much wheat or materials like that. So all those low-slung bothies as such, all that's with heather, yeah.
Are these wild crops, or do you have to make sure that they are looked after in a particular way so that they're useful?
Yes. Well, we'll take long straw, for example. We have to cut the raw material with old machinery. Now, that sounds strange, but...
Are you sure? There's not a computer we can bring in here.
We just can't use modern machinery like combine harvesters. We have to use the old reaper binders. Actually, the most modern harvest machinery I've got is a reaper binder from 1950. But the reaper binder cuts the straw in a slightly green state, so it's not overly ripe. So the crop is then cut slightly green. The sheaves are then stood up to dry in the fields for 2 or 3 weeks, and the grain ripens. And then the straw is then, or the crop is then carted into a corn stack, ready for threshing out with an old threshing machine. Now, a threshing machine requires 8 people to work it. But it's a fancy bit of machinery designed back in the 19th century, and it doesn't break up the straw. It's very gentle with it, and whereas with a combine harvest, it's all grunt and it ends up like candy floss.
And I'm imagining at its peak, thatch was taking advantage of waste material, whereas now that must be reducing, I'm assuming, to very low levels. Can you still find it now, or is it fairly stable?
Well, with straw, for example, it is a byproduct. But the farmers that grow thatching straw are specialised now, and their byproduct as such is the grain.
That's a nice byproduct.
Yeah. Whereas reed cutters, obviously they're cutting reed every year or every other year, and that is the main crop as it grows annually. And with heather, there's not much harvested these days. It's an old tradition that's virtually extinct, but that was on a 15-year cycle. So the heather would be cut every 15 years and then used on the roof.
So how is demand for thatch then? There are certain buildings that are listed where it has to have thatch, but in terms of an art form, what's it been going through these last few years?
In the UK, we generally consider thatching for listed buildings, our old building stock. For the most part, it's about conservation of our existing building stock. Whereas if you were to go on to the continent, Holland, Denmark, Germany, you'd find that they've been building tens of thousands of new builds. So they've got a slightly more open view about thatch. They actually believe in it, whereas people in the UK are still sceptical. They don't quite trust it. And I guess, say the Dutch in particular, they'd be considering the sustainable and the green factors, but it is their belief that thatching is a viable building material.
Well, at this point, I suppose the pros and cons might be interesting to touch on, so maybe you can run through some of those.
The cons really are it's labour intensive. The cost of thatching is more than most types of roofing material. Concrete tiles we just can't compete with. But whereas if you were to look at old peg tiles, old clay peg tiles and Welsh slate, the price is fairly comparable then. So, yeah, the cost factor is a bit of a disadvantage for most people. The benefits, of course, are you're using a sustainable material, you're providing local employment, you're using a material that is basically a carbon sink, and it's got good insulation and keeps the weather out.
What about fires? Some people talk about straw bale houses being dangerous. I know they're not when they've actually shown these tests, but thatch.
Well, we all know that thatch burns. The media often put it in the papers on the TV, unfortunately. But thatch in itself is not a fire risk. The risk is modern living. So it could be modern appliances, electrical faults, wood burners in conjunction with poorly lined and dirty chimney tops are probably the main cause of thatch fires. And once a thatch does catch alight, they're very difficult to put out. And if you were to ask the fire services, they'd tell you all about that. They would fire their fire hydrants and water hoses all over the thatch, and the water just bounces off. And the only way they can tackle that is by making fire breaks or let it burn. With modern thatching, we tend to put a fire barrier underneath. So if there ever was a fire, the thatch would burn off as sacrificial and the building's safe.
And with that underneath, I'm assuming that not many fires start from the other side, unless you're very unlucky on a hot summer's day and someone throws a petrol bomb.
I suppose if you go back 20, 30 years ago when farmers were burning the combine straw or the residue of the fields, there was a few fires there, but other than that, there's people with bonfires. That's rare. Most thatch fires either start from inside, a kitchen fire, for example, but, it'd burn the whole house down anyway. But yes, it is really the wood burners and flue pipes, dirty flues.
Let's have a look at the roof then itself. Does it vary much, or do you need it at a certain pitch? What are the considerations?
There's an optimum pitch of at least 50 degrees. So anything under that, you're going to find that the rainwater will sit on it and not drain and shed off quite so quickly. And that will mean the decay will be that much quicker. So the steeper the roof, the slower the decay. That's the main consideration, and making sure that the thatch is compact but can breathe on the surface as well. So it doesn't want to be like cast iron concrete on the surface. It's got to breathe a little bit on the surface.
So talk us through, if you were putting up a new thatch, it sounds like you don't do this very often, you just build on top of thatch, but if you were going to do a building, putting a thatch on, how would you do that?
Right, well, we'll start off with the raw materials. There's a few details on the roof that have to be dealt with, batten sizes and details around the barges and eaves, but anyway, we've got the raw material. We've clearly got a problem. There's tens of millions of stems there. How do you get all those stems that are shifting everywhere up onto a roof. Well, the way we have to do it is with, say, a bunch of reed, they'd be tied up, and that is purely for taking the material up there. It's not a manufactured unit like a tile. It's just a way of taking the material up. And the same with straw. The straw will be prepared into what we call yelms, which are basically a straw tile. And that's a means of taking it up onto the roof. And we'd start just like we would with tiles at the eaves, and each layer or course would be staggered up the roof, and fixed every time on every course. What you can do is you can alter the specification of the thatch by making it thicker, thinner.
Why do you do that, or in what circumstances?
Well, for example, if you wanted a warmer roof and a longer lasting roof, you'd go for a thicker specification, because it would take that much longer for the decay to wear down to the fixings. And when the fixings start to appear on the surface over a period of years of decay, that's the time to replace the thatch.
And when you come to replace it, you're not actually taking it out though, are you? Or are you?
Well, with reed, we'd take everything off and start from scratch onto the rafters. With straw, traditionally, over many, many centuries, the existing layer of straw that's fixed to the rafters that has worn down will stay in place, and we'll put a new layer of straw thatch on top of it using hazel fixings. And they're basically like a twisted staple with point at each end, and we use thousands of those, and you just fix it into the old thatch.
And it's okay from wind? There are never any circumstances where it lifts off in a section?
A well-thatched roof does not suffer from wind. I rarely go and do any repairs on thatched roofs that have got wind damage, unless they've got to the stage where they're completely worn out.
I've seen certain thatches that get covered. So what is that all about? Is it necessary? Is it for a certain type of thatch?
Yeah, what you'd find on the surface of thatch is lichens, sometimes moss, mostly lichens, just like sort of green sheen on it. Lichens are not a problem for thatch because although they hold a little bit of moisture, they do ventilate and breathe and actually can make the roof last longer. Whereas moss, if it's allowed to get too thick on the surface, will retain the moisture longer for fungal decay, and that's what you don't want.
I was thinking more of chicken wire. I should have specified that.
Chicken wire. Chicken wire's a strange story because it's only this country that uses it. In fact, wire netting was invented in Norwich, just up the road from here. And
so it's using some local product. You need to get some wire netting on there.
Yeah, well, that was being produced in industrial scale, not particularly for thatching at the time in the 19th century, but for fencing and, all sorts. And during the agricultural depression of the late 19th century, when we were importing all the grain from the Americas, our farms went into decline, and we were finding we were getting the master thatchers were in competition with farm thatchers because they'd lost their jobs. Now, a farm thatcher would be thatching the corn stacks, which are only designed to last for a few months because they then take the corn stack apart to thrash it out to get the grain out. So we were getting poor quality thatch. And we had plagues of sparrows at the time, we don't now. So wire netting started to be used. They never used it on the continent, and they lost their straw thatching traditions. So you'll only find straw thatching in this country. You could say because we put the wire netting on, but you have to start thinking, well, do we really need the wire netting on there now? We don't really get the sparrow problems that we did many years ago. And it's a shame that we don't see the sparrows, but from a thatcher's point of view, we don't mind.
It, did they? Right, gotcha. So just going back round to the continent, I think I'm right in saying that you've done a fair bit of travelling and checking out a few things over there. So what are some modern day uses of thatch? It goes beyond roofs.
Well, thatched walls. I thatched with some colleagues of mine a new building in Norwich called the Enterprise Centre. Now, that building was something different because it was so big we couldn't thatch the roof. It would have meant that the roof would have been 200 feet up in the air. So that was obviously far too costly and not what the contractors and the UEA wanted to undertake. So the idea came about that we thatched the walls. And what we did was we thatched it in sectional form in our sheds and barns. And it was then, these sectional thatch panels were then transported to the site and they were craned into position. So it's built like a jigsaw. The tricky thing was to hide the joins because thatch is designed to be one unit. No seams, it's just one unit, unlike tiles, which are all units. So that was something different. I think the architectural world's still coming to terms with that building because it's just far out there. But we would expect those thatch walls at the Enterprise Centre at the UEA to last in the region of 50 years plus, mainly because they're so vertical. The weather never gets to them, so they never get any fungal decay, and so they don't wear back. And they even keep their colour. So, yeah, that's something.
What are the most spectacular houses that you've seen that have been thatched? They could well be in your home county here or far away.
Well, some of the spectacular ones that we have in this country are really some of the ideal home buildings that were built in the 1930s. And big country homes with thatched roofs. It was all in vogue in the 1930s with the royal family. So you've got some very interesting buildings there. We have barn conversions here. Thatch looks quite simple. But if we were to go over to Holland, the styles, the architecture, and the ingenuity of using thatch in different ways is just amazing. Yeah, they're not afraid to push the boundaries over there.
What would it take for us to follow suit?
A more open mind and be prepared to take on thatching and realise there isn't any risks, or there's very little risks in it failing in the short term, and just embrace it. So what we need is developers, building control, and thatch owners, or future thatch owners, to buy these properties.
My wife is a big fan of thatch, and I've certainly thought about it for our own build, but there are a couple of things that are stopping me, and one of them is resale, particularly of a new building. So have you any experience of, are people turned off by having a thatch roof, or particularly on new buildings I'm talking about? I think the old listed ones doesn't really make much difference.
No. Yeah, I think one of the reasons why there isn't so much new build in this country is it's tricky to get a mortgage because the regulations for thatching is non-existent. There's no uniform specification. So it comes to a grinding halt there. It needs some kind of warranty sorted out so that people can get mortgages from the mortgage companies. So I don't know what the answer there is really.
No, I'm not expecting all the answers here. We've had a good overview of thatch. Is there anything else you feel we should be mentioning and tying into this conversation? Self-builders just looking at thatch.
I would say look at all the benefits. Just consider it, weigh up the costs. If you're trying to get planning consent, I think you'd find that the planners would look favourably. You'd have to get through building control and get your finances and mortgage money sorted out, obviously. But there are specialised companies that do provide money.
And where will we go for solid advice?
For solid thatching advice, it's probably best to go to your local thatching organisation. So most of them are county-based. I belong to an association called the East Anglia Master Thatchers, and we cover Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex and Hertfordshire. We're one of the very few thatching organisations that actually publishes standards and specifications, so you know what you're getting, and there's a peace of mind. And our members have to guarantee our work to that specification.
Stephen, thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Head online to take a look at the show notes that accompany this session. They're at houseplanninghelp.com/160 today. You can review the key points. We've got some lovely photos on there. If you do love thatch, I think you'll enjoy just perusing the show notes today. If you have a comment or perhaps a question, just scroll down to the bottom of the show notes. It's the usual place to leave those there. And we've got links to the National Thatching Straw Growers Association and East Anglia Master Thatchers Association. We'll put how to get in touch with Stephen. houseplanninghelp.com/160. Let's close on a hub update, and we just had our latest progress call where this was interesting actually. I've mentioned to everyone in the hub that I'm looking forward to using the video feature this year. We're on a platform called Zoom at the moment, which allows video conferencing and audio conferencing. And I actually thought I had control of the situation, that we were doing an audio call, and Dean said, do you want to see a few photos or visualizations of the house that I'm about to build? And we thought, well, go on, let's see what happens. And it all worked. So actually, we've got the video side of things underway a lot quicker than I imagined. Also, the latest video from Buckinghamshire Passive House just gone in. This is all about the basement, Glatar. We'll hopefully have a podcast on that fairly soon as well. We're working on a module for buying land. I share some of my experiences and that, tips and things that I've learned going through the process. 3 reasons that you might want to join the hub as you tackle your self-build. Well, probably top of the list is really about just getting to know like-minded people. It can be a lonely environment. You're not the only person going through this. Secondly, I would say sometimes it's just a good place to pitch even a simple question, because we're all building energy efficient homes. It might be something that you've already answered your own question and you're just looking to see what other people will think of it. And thirdly, it is that continuation of learning. We're always learning. We'll never stop learning. But what we're trying to do in the hub is make it fun, get those in-depth video case studies, more and more of them. Obviously, my own project will be our 3rd video case study. That will be quite exciting. We've got the modules that we're trying to flesh out this year and make more outcome driven. So we're constantly changing things in there and trying to make it better. At the moment, enrollment is closed, but our next enrollment window will open some point in the spring. So be first to find out about it. Get on our VIP early bird list, houseplanninghelp.com/join. Next time, I talk through the process of hiring an architect and I reveal who I'm going to be working with. Thanks for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.